that okay? Okay, just a reminder that office hours are today 3:30 till 5. Okay, one last time on Putnam on meaning and reference, and then on Friday we'll go on to Evans's article, The Causal Theory of Names. Evans's article is really a book. It's a very rich, dense article. So start reading it early and read it often. If you see what I mean, it's be braced. Today I want to look at the implications. What I want to get to is the implications of causal theories of reference for knowledge of your own mind. This is a really rich area, and it's somewhere where these things about informative identities and meaning without reference that we talked about earlier and how they're difficult on a causal theory. When you see what happens, the causal theory really starts to blow up our ordinary picture of the mind. The causal theory thinks of the mind as formed by its relation to the environment. The mind is constituted by relations between you and your environment. And the classical picture that philosophers have had of the mind as something over here and the world as something out there, and the mind is this domain where you can just internally scan everything that's going on, it actually gets blown up by the causal theory. And we'll look at the pressure points of these things about informative identities and meaning without reference. So you'll see the kind of dimensions that these things start to take on in just a bit. But this is a lesser point. This is a point kind of on the way. There are two different ways of interpreting what Putnam says about natural kind terms, about terms like water and so on. And last time I was giving an explanation, I gave you one reading of what he's saying. And in this reading, water is a word that's kind of like bright, right? Bright? Hello? We all remember Bright? Dear old Bright, inventor of the wheel, probably a woman, probably over 5 foot tall, all that kind of stuff, yeah? Bright? Yeah, okay. So the name with its reference fixed by description, all you know about the name is that's the description. So last time I was explaining Putnam as saying the meaning of water, the reference of water, is fixed by the description, whatever it is that's in the rivers and lakes, participating in the evaporation, condensation, precipitation cycle, and so on. But there is a different reading of them. That doesn't really give any specifically causal work, any work for causation to do. But there is another reading of Putnam, which I think is the reading he eventually went for, which is to say, no, that's not the right way to think of it, actually, the way I was expounding him last time. The right way to think of the implications of the twin Earth cases is that water is subject to a causal theory of reference. The reason you're talking about water, about H2O, when you're using water on Earth, is that H2O is what we are all causally connected to. Whereas on twin Earth, the reason that when they use water, they're talking about XYZ, is that XYZ is what they're all causally connected to. So there's no descriptive element in the meaning of the name. It's just a causal connection. These are two different readings. I think if you look at the Putnam piece carefully, he's just a very bright guy, and these different theories are kind of spinning off, and it takes a while for it to settle down and for him to fasten onto one, and he fastened onto that one eventually. But to start out, is that reasonably clear so far? Okay. So to start out, let's just look at the notion of a natural kind. Then we'll see what Putnam says about natural kinds in this reading. And then finally, we'll look at the larger topic of your knowledge of your own mind. Yeah, and how the mind gets blown up by the causal theory. What is a natural kind? Putnam uses that phrase, natural kind. But what does it mean? Anything? Anyone? Well, okay, think of this as an exam question. What would you say? Well, it's a kind found in nature, right? I mean, it's a kind that, sorry?
Something that George W. Bush answered.
Yes, right. But that actually wouldn't be a bad start. It's a kind found in nature. And the idea is that there are classifications like people I like, where the people I like might be a wild and diverse collection, right? There's nothing much in common. All they have in common is I like them. You see what I mean? That doesn't mean that there's anything in common between the things out there. On the other hand, if you take something like people who have a particular red cell count in their blood, that's a distinction that's out there. It doesn't depend what anyone thinks about it. If you take Putnam's examples, the distinction between things that are gold and things that are silver, that's a distinction that's out there in the world, and we just try and find out about it. What scientists are doing is trying to find out about these distinctions that are out there in the world independently of us. So the idea of a natural kind is something like this, that there are some classifications that exist in the world independently of us. These are the natural ones. There are a lot of distinctions that are just projected by us onto the world. That are just reflections of our own interests and our own preferences. These are not natural kinds. We just make these up. Yeah. So particularly if you think about chemistry, what chemistry is all about is, in my view, is sorting substances into types. And this is not a matter of what anyone's interested in. This is just basic facts about what's going on out there. And with these natural kinds, how we find out about them is one thing, and what they are intrinsically is another. And our picture is, if you take a chemical substance, for example, there's a structure out there underlying the chemical substance, and it causes different symptoms. It expresses itself in different ways, and we just try and probe it. So if you take the case of gold, right, for a long time, I mean, gold has been of special interest for thousands of years. So how do you tell whether something's gold or not? How do you tell whether something's gold or not? Very good, melt it, yeah, right. It was known for a long time, for thousands of years, that the points at which things melt and the points at which they turn into gases, the points at which they boil, finding those exact points, everything has its own distinctive boiling point and melting point, yeah? So that's a very handy way of finding out. But Archimedes, you know the story of Archimedes? Sorry?
The guy that like in the bathtub and just like jumped out of it.
That's right, he was in a bathtub and he jumped out of it, but why?
He discovered volume, was it?
He discovered volume. Yeah, that's very close. But why did he care about volume?
Well, it's trying to cheat.
Sorry?
It was someone was cheating the king of gold.
Very good. In what way cheating the king?
He was making gold with other metals involved as well, cheaper gold.
That's close, but not quite. Anyone? Don't say you don't learn anything in this class. Not you. You always get it right. Okay, well, you can tell me if I get this wrong. The story as I have it is that there was a neighboring king who had been at war with Archimedes' king. Yeah? So things were not good between them. It's a very poignant story, this. And the neighboring king sent Archimedes' king a crown that looked gold, felt like gold. Yeah? Now, the thing is, Archimedes' king suspected that this might be a fake, just as you suggest. It might be made of brass or some mixture of other metals. In which case, that would be a great insult. And if the king took it, he would look like an idiot. Yeah? Going around with this fake crown. On the other hand, how could the king find out if the crown was real or not? Melt it, right? Because if you melt it, then it will decompose into its constituent metals. But suppose you do that, and it turns out that the crown is made of gold all the way through. Then you have taken the gift, the peacemaking gift of your former enemy, and melted it. And it's a highly unfriendly act, right? So there's a real problem, right? So that's what he's thinking about in the bath. And what he's thinking about in the bath is, there must be another way than melting. There must be a way we haven't thought of so far of figuring out whether something is gold. Yep. And that's a lot of the history of chemistry, finding out better and better tests for whether something is a particular substance. Yeah. On the other hand, if you take, and of course he did, well, I mean, the way he did that was he noted, as someone said, that he was displacing a certain amount of water in the bath. So you could, I mean, this is of no philosophical interest, but I'll just tell you anyway, that he could use that to find the volume of the crown, that displacement of water to find the volume of the crown. He could then weigh the crown and find its density. And that would give him another fix on whether it was gold than by melting it, right? So that's a new test that you haven't had before for finding whether something's gold. Yeah. But not everything is like that. If you take, is something mud, right? People have complained about mud for centuries. Yeah. But would it make sense to find new ways of telling whether something is mud? Is this really mud? I mean, Archimedes leaping out. Yes, I've got a new way of finding out whether there's no such thing, right? I mean, mud is mud. You can't, I mean, I don't know any way of explaining this more plainly than what I just said, but I mean, how can you have a new way of finding out whether something's mud? Something's mud if it's muddy, and that's that. Yeah? There isn't a new way of finding out whether something's mud. Or if something's dusty, right? Is this dusty? Well, you can't find a new way of finding out things like that, right? Or finding out if someone is a person I like. Well, you can't get a new test for that, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? So with natural kinds, it makes sense that there's something out there, the underlying structure of gold, that you're probing at, you're trying to chisel away at in lots of different ways. Ways of testing for a disease, right? There's something out there and you're just trying to chisel away, find different ways of getting at it. Whereas with other sorts, then, I mean, the apotheosis of natural kind classification is the periodic table, right? What's the periodic law? Don't say you don't learn anything in this class. Archimedes, the periodic law, right? The periodic law says the chemical properties of an element are a periodic function of its atomic number. That's to say, when you line them all up by their atomic number, then you find that the way they behave in interaction with other chemicals, the properties they display, are actually a function of their atomic number. So it looks like the atomic number is what makes the element behave the way it does. Yeah, it's the underlying structure that makes it behave the way it does. So there's that underlying structure having atomic number 79 that makes gold melt at the temperature it does, that makes gold have the density that it does. It's the thing that underlies all these tests you might carry out. So water displays these wetness, rain and so on Earth, and it's because it's got the H2O molecule that it does that stuff. On twin Earth, is XYZ, that's explaining that behavior. On, if you take something like being striped, ferocious, four-footed, and clawed, then presumably it's the DNA structure of the animal that makes it like that. Yeah? With animals, you think that DNA is the basis of the sorting into biological species. But there are plenty of other classifications like beautiful, well-designed, or cool, or gives me a strange ripply feeling. That's a good one. It gives me a strange ripply feeling, right? I mean, could you find better tests than we have already for establishing whether something gives me a strange ripply feeling? No, of course you couldn't. I mean, okay, so is that absolutely plain as day? That's natural kinds versus non-natural kinds. Okay, yep.
I also refers to it as observer independent and observer dependent.
Observer independent and observer dependent. That's absolutely a way of getting at it. So which side would the natural kinds go on?
Observer independent.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
intrinsic nature.
The intrinsic nature, yeah. Gives me a strange ripply feeling. Is that observer dependent? Sure, I mean, it's me, it's how I'm feeling, if you see what I mean, yeah. Okay, there are difficult cases where it's really hard to know, like intelligence. Take the sliding scale of intelligence, right? Is that a natural kind? Well, people say, sure, that's important, that's really important. Look, what we're looking for in a good student is that they have a high G. You see what I mean? Yeah, a high IQ. That's a very important thing. And then on the other hand, there's this thing out there, intelligence, that you try and sort people by. Yeah, and we actually talk like that a lot of the time. You know, you say someone's very smart, or you know, someone's not too smart, and or that kind of thing. But is there any such thing? I mean, is there any such thing as? I mean, people say no. There are lots of different kinds of intelligence. There's social intelligence, emotional intelligence, spatial intelligence, and maybe it all just fragments into a million different things. There isn't really any such thing as intelligence. I mean, just as a matter of curiosity, what do you guys think? Is there such a thing as intelligence? Is there a natural kind out there, intelligence? Is this a question or a vote?
No, in response to what you're saying. There's something called G, which is...
G, yes, right.
Which is sort of like the core of intelligence, because it's a factor that affects other types of intelligence. So if you have a high G type of intelligence, it's correlated with being good in reading or math or emotional intelligence.
Yeah, right. That's exactly the idea that intelligence is a natural kind. There is this factor out there, your G, that is determining your intelligence. And then on the other hand, people just blow that up and say, look, someone from a very different culture than the cultures in which we talk about intelligence is going to score very badly on these tests. But all that shows is that these tests are culturally specific. There is no culture-independent G, yeah? And there is no G independent of highly contextual factors about what kind of reasoning or task you're thinking of. Can you put your hand up if you think the answer is yes, intelligence is a natural kind. There is some phenomenon out there, something like G. Put your hand up if you think the answer is yes. I'm just curious what you think. There's no right answer here. I mean, there is a right answer, but I don't know what it is. I'm just curious what you guys think. Yes? Oh, is that a question or?
No, we think so.
You do think so? Okay. Boy, you're a minority, and if you don't think so? Wow, okay, that's really interesting, okay. But you guys presumably you guys talk all the time about people being smart or not smart and so on, no?
But all that requires someone's interpretation of
Yes, yeah, so okay, that's right. So you could say, well, it's just not a natural kind, it's observer dependent. Yes, what I make of the person. Okay.
There's no objective intelligence per se.
Yes, right. I'm not telling you this. I mean, I think it's wide open. That question is my own impression. Yeah. Okay. Another difficult case is, well, psychiatric disorders are difficult cases. You take the symptoms of schizophrenia. Symptoms of schizophrenia are things like having delusions, thinking I'm the king of Spain or whatever, stuff like that. Thinking, having hallucinations, seeing scorpions chasing each other around the clock, as one does, right? Disorganized speech, bearing no relation to the present discourse, and affective flattening and cognitive flattening too, actually. And then there's a question: is that like water? Can you have some kind of periodic table of psychiatric disorders? And there's going to be some special brain virus or something that you've got, that's what having schizophrenia is? Or is this just observer dependent? Is this just the way someone strikes us, and that's all there is to be said about it? I mean, again, that question seems to me completely wide open right now. Nobody knows. You could say, well, there's a single brain disturbance underlying all these symptoms, but actually the evidence is that there is no single brain disturbance. At the moment, that's what it looks like, but as with anything about the brain, it's kind of wide open. Okay, that's it for natural kinds? Okay, so the distinctions that are there in the world independently of us. So in this second way of reading Putnam, names for substances are logically proper names. So just as you've got Al Gore referring to Al, you've got water referring to H2O. So you could have natural kind terms for all the elements, stuff like water, gold, tigers, I guess electron, magnetism, gamma ray bursts. I guess these are all natural kind terms. Yeah? And so what's going on is there's this stuff out there, there's this underlying structure out there. You see the symptoms of it, you respond to the symptoms of it, and you tag it with a name. Yeah? And it's what you're causally responding to that is fixing the references of the terms. So just as proper names, Kripke said, represent because there's a causal relation to the object, words for natural kinds represent because there's a causal relation to the stuff. So just as a kind of exercise, on this view, is it going to be a priori that water is the stuff that fills the rivers and lakes and falls from the skies and so on? Nope. It's going to be very obvious, but not a priori. Yeah, because what you're referring to when you say water is not fixed by description, it's just fixed by this causal chain. And this is just a very obvious piece of information that you got from way of the causal chain. So this is a different take to the one you had last time. There's that structure out there. We're causally responding to it. There's that structure out there in Twin Earth. They're causally responding to that one. So just as we, with Frege, we started out saying you've got the sign and the sense is being expressed by description, but names are more primitive than descriptions. So we've got this base class of ordinary names that are rigid and they get the reference fixed by a causal chain. Well, words like water and gamma ray burst and so on are all down there. They're logically proper names. Okay? Now with logically proper names, as we saw, there are problems about informativeness. How can you have an uninformative identity involving signs whose reference is fixed by a causal chain? Do you remember that problem? Yeah? As you get two identical photographs, can it be a priori that they refer to the same thing? No, because they might be photographs of twins, right? And can there be signs that have meaning but don't refer? No, because if the sign has meaning, that can only be because of a causal chain. But if there's a causal chain from some object to it, that's the thing it refers to. So you can't have meaning without reference. You can't have uninformative identities, and you can't have meaning without reference. But that means there are going to be a lot of problems about your knowledge of your own mental states. Remember that affecting, you would think that if you just look inside your mind, you know when you're having the same thought and you know when you're having a different thought, right? Yeah, that seems, if you can't do that, you can't do anything, right? Okay, but remember the story of Spot? Remember that affecting story of Spot? Dear old Spot, you say, yeah, after the terrible catastrophe and your father's kind replacement of Spot by a similar dog, dear old Spot, you say, how happy I am to see you again. Yeah, I think this every time I come home to you, Spot, you say, yeah. But are you having the same thought you had yesterday? You can't be. It's a different dog, different causal chain. Yeah? There was an unnoticed substitution. So different causal chains are underpinning your thoughts now and then. So you're not having the same thoughts you were having yesterday, even though you think you are. The meaning is being fixed by this relation between you and your environment. That's not something that you're authoritative about. You can't tell about that just by reflecting on it. So you don't even know when you're having the same thought again. There's a great story by Isaac Bashevis Singer about a man who leaves his village to journey to another village, and he's walking for hundreds of miles. And each night when he's camping, the way he sets his direction for the next day is he leaves his shoes outside his tent, pointing in the direction that he's going, right? That's what we all do, right? And then one night, after he's a couple of weeks out, someone during the night turns his shoes in the other direction. So after many weeks of traveling, he eventually returns to his home village, and he finds that the world is even stranger than he thought it was. He says, my God, this is exactly like my home village. You look exactly like my wife. They seem just like the horses we had in my old village. I wonder if they're biologically the same, if they're really the same as the horses from my old village. You just find, you know, that's what happens when you travel. You find that really strange stuff happens, right? That's what he's found. So he's looking at all the same people, all the same animals, the same water and so on, in just the same way. But for him, it would be highly informative to be told, this is your wife. Yeah? So he's got exactly the same take on all these people, on all these animals, on that stuff, but he doesn't know it's the same. So in the case of Spot, you think you're thinking the same thoughts, but you're not, right? In this case, you think you're thinking different thoughts, but you're not. You have really lost authority over what's going on in your head. And remember this idea of traveling back and forth between Earth and twin Earth, right? I mean, if you travel, if you were being swapped out with your double periodically through your life, then the references of your signs would be changing. But you wouldn't realize it, right? So you'd think you were having the same thoughts, but you weren't. There's also another possibility, which is that you think you're traveling between Earth and twin Earth, but you're not. Right? That could happen too. So you look at this scene on Earth at one moment, then you feel that kind of transient judder that you take to be the sign that you've been swapped to twin Earth, and you look at this scene and you say, it looks so similar, but of course it's so different, right? This stuff is so different to this stuff, but you actually haven't moved an inch. That could happen, yes? So you think you're observing the same scene. You think you're observing a different scene, but you're actually looking at the same scene, thinking about it in just the same way. You don't have authority over your thoughts. You don't know when you're thinking the same thought again and when you're not. Yep?
But wouldn't it influence the way that you think about it because you're making an assumption that you're someone different than you are? Like the man that came back to his own town.
Yeah.
The first time he was thinking that it was his town.
That's right.
The second time he wasn't thinking that it was his town.
That's right.
Are they different thoughts?
Are they different thoughts? Well, the thing is, when he looks at a horse, say, and says that kind of thing is very similar to the kind of thing I have back home. Yeah. What's the way in which he's thinking about it differently?
Because he's sort of like making the assumption that he's this traveller and he's got a long distance, so there's a sort of underlying assumption that things are going to be different.
I agree there is that underlying assumption, but if you think about the way of getting onto a thing that he's got in the two cases, if I just think of my way of getting onto horses, I mean, what town I'm in is not really relevant. You see what I mean? I mean, of course there are horses around here, but there are horses all over the place. You know, it's part of my concept of horses that they're not bound to be around here. You see what I mean? So he's got this global conception of horses, yeah, and he's got it from being presented with them, from his causal contact with them, and a descriptive phrase like "what's in my hometown" isn't part of that meaning. You see what I mean? So you've got your thoughts about horses, but you don't know when you're having the same ones again. Yeah. So the idea of your mind is something you look into, and you know what's going on in there, has just been lost. Yeah. If only it was so easy. What fills the causal chain is independent of what's going on in your head. Yeah, that's right. But your thoughts aren't over here in your head, because the causal chain is constituting your thoughts. Yeah. So your causal, the thoughts are, in those terms, the thoughts are out there too. The thoughts are just a part of the world over which you have only insecure knowledge, yeah, only insecure authority. You don't have that kind of knowledge of your own mind that you might have thought you did. I mean, it's very natural to think, in the way you just put it, that there are the personal thoughts, or the thoughts in here that I really do know about. And here's Descartes. Descartes, what shall I now say that I am when I am supposing that there is some supremely powerful, and if it is permissible to say, malicious deceiver who is deliberately trying to trick me in every way he can, right? You all remember this kind of stuff? Yeah? Okay. Well, what does Descartes say? He says, it all might be a dream. None of these people, none of these tables and chairs might be there. Can I now assert I possess even the most insignificant of attributes, which I have just said belong to the nature of body? No, of course not, right? It's all a dream. Yeah, no body, no tables and chairs, no other people, none of that stuff. Well, what do you have? Last I've discovered it, thought. That alone is inseparable from me. So what's going on when the demon is deceiving him is that he's alone with his thoughts, right? You don't have any knowledge of the world out there. You just have your thoughts, and you know about them all right. Yeah, that's such a natural picture. But if the causal theory is right, it just blows this up. That couldn't happen. If you took the world away, you'd take all the causal chains away. So you'd be left with nothing. You wouldn't have any thoughts. And it's not as if, even if you do have thoughts, you can know which they are, independent of how you're causally hooked up to the world. If the demon is messing about with how you're causally hooked up to the world, then the demon is messing about with which thoughts you're having, and you wouldn't know that was going on. So when you think of thinking, right, you tend to think, when I'm in this situation, right, when I'm just doing the hunch, I'm completely authoritative about what's going on in here. I know whether I'm thinking, and I know what I'm thinking. Yeah? And knowing whether I'm thinking requires, but the trouble is, on a causal theory, knowing whether I'm thinking requires that I be causally hooked up to the world. Because it's only if I'm causally hooked up to the world that I'm having any thoughts at all. So I've got to, in that situation, be able to get it. That whether I'm causally hooked up to the world. And knowing what I'm thinking demands that I be able to sort my thoughts and say, this is the same thought again, or this is a different thought. That's kind of minimal. If you didn't have that, you wouldn't know anything about what you're thinking. But the causal theory blows that up too, because these causal chains can be being swapped around without you knowing. And so in that situation, there is no inner realm that you're authoritative about. That picture has just gone out of the window. Yep. Why are we assuming that the words you use to describe your thoughts dictate what your thoughts are? Well, okay, there may well be room for challenge here, but what I'm thinking is I express my thought using language, yeah, using the words, and the words express my thoughts perfectly. That's to say, so why am I assuming that? Well, suppose I say, right, the word changes meaning. Yeah, well, but if I've got a causal theory of reference, I guess I'm assuming I've also got a causal theory of thought. Because so many of my thoughts are in language. Yeah? Like when we're talking right now, right, you and I are talking and using the words. For me, anyway, there's not a whole lot of stuff going on backstage. You see what I mean? You know, sometimes you can be having a conversation where you've got a very careful agenda, and each move you make is carefully planned, and you say, now I'm going to do this, and now I'm going to do that, right? But when I'm talking right now, you know, what you see is what that is, if you see what I mean. It is thinking, I think, right? But all the thought is in the language.
But I mean, if all of a sudden we're not in this world anymore, and you have a God and a thought, and now we're in a different world, so
Right.
a different thought, but
Yes,
The meaning of spot changed.
that's right.
But you didn't know it, but you're still thinking about your old spot. You're just using the wrong word. The meaning changed.
Well, that's what I don't think. That's what I don't quite agree with, right? I mean, suppose I get home to the new Spot, yeah, and Spot is running around looking for food, the new Spot, and I say, Spot's hungry. Am I thinking about the old Spot or the new Spot? New Spot, right? Yeah, but I want this case. I agree there are, no, I'm serious really, I agree there are other cases, but in my case, what I'm thinking about has shifted and I didn't realize it. Yeah, I don't have any authority over that. To realize there had been the shift, I would have to have done some investigation. You see what I mean? You don't look happy, but yes.
I'm not sure how on the first bullet point we lose that you know whether you're thinking.
Yes.
So if we take a person who's like massively mixed up about the causal chain, like what they're referring to. So we have a Spot who is not the original Spot, and he says that Spot. And so on the one hand, it seems like he's referring to that thing, but on the other hand, he like maybe has some other
Yeah.
reference or something like this. It seems like he's unclear about what he's thinking. That seems fair. But it seems like he still has an immediate experience of thinking something. So it seems like he's certain that he's thinking.
Okay, very good. No, that's very good. You're right. I didn't give a crisp example of the kind of thing I have in mind here, not knowing whether you're thinking. You're thinking of a case in which someone is mixed up and it hasn't disentangled. And it's not just that their mind is empty of thought. Okay, I guess what I had in mind was more the Descartes thing, where there's no Spot there at all, right? And then what are you thinking, right? There never was a Spot, but you had, the demon made you think there was a Spot.
Okay, so I'm trying to refer to something, but nothing is there.
Right.
There's like no causal chain.
There's no causal chain. And therefore, in the causal theory, there's no thought. Yeah, because it's tempting to say, well, I've got a description, the dog which, or whatever, something like that. But the whole point of the causal theory was to sweep that aside and say that doesn't give you, that's not the meaning of Spot, right? The whole meaning of Spot is given by the causal chain, and if you remove that, there is nothing left of the meaning. Yeah. So if I'm saying Spot's hungry, then there is no thought I'm expressing in this view. Yeah. So if he is thinking Spot's hungry, yeah, he thinks, well, I'm looking inside my head, I'm thinking, so what am I thinking? Well, I'm thinking that Spot's hungry. He's wrong. There is no such thought there.
There's no meaningful thought.
Yeah, what's a meaningless thought?
Wouldn't there still be like an experience of thinking?
There would be an experience, and you can call it an experience of thinking, but it wouldn't be thinking. Yeah, there wouldn't be any thoughts in there. Yeah, so you don't know whether you're thinking. 1, 2. Yeah.
I was thinking along the same lines. Can you say that like your thoughts about Spot and Twin Spot are sort of indistinguishable?
That's right, they are indistinguishable.
There could be some kind of like thought data.
Thought data, yes, right.
Such that like that you have perfect knowledge of, but you don't actually have perfect knowledge of. You have the perfect knowledge of the seeming of your thoughts.
Yeah.
And what they seem to be about, but not of what they actually are.
I agree that's an appealing kind of move, but I just say, note how far back you're going here, right? You're accepting you don't know what you're thinking, but this thought, well, if one of them gives me a strange ripply feeling, maybe the other one gives me a strange ripply feeling too. You see what I mean? That there are some ways in which they strike me, these two thoughts, that are kind of similar. That's all you've got. They're both a bit ripply. Okay, well, they're both kind of canine. That's all you got. I mean, you would have thought, the natural idea is that this guy has a much more laser-like knowledge of the internal realm than that. This guy knows exactly what's going on in there, yeah? But, so I agree there are kind of back-off moves you can make, but the startling thing is that you have to back off so far, yeah? Yeah.
Don't you have, can't you say that you have an intention of thought even though
You can have an intention to think even though there's no object.
Exactly. So for instance, I can have a hallucination in which I think that I see a dagger, but I don't necessarily have an intentional object of the dagger. So in
Yeah,
that regard, I can be certain that I'm thinking of something. My thought carries intentionality, even though there's no intentionality.
Right. You can try to find some descriptive stuff here, yeah, and say, well, there is a dog, yeah. But if I want to feed Spot, it is Spot I want to feed, not just I want to feed a dog. You see what I mean? Or at any rate, these are two very different states. You know, you might just think I'd love to feed a dog, right? But it's a different thing if it's Spot you want to feed, yeah. And you can think that you can appear to have the intention to feed Spot, but not be having any intention at all. Yeah, yeah. You could hang on to the intention to feed a dog, but that's something different. Yeah. Yeah. I put it around the other way. Suppose you look inside your mind and you think, what am I thinking about? Well, I'm thinking about water. Well, you know, this twin earth stuff is driving me nuts, so I'm thinking about water, right? Now, you know you're thinking about water, right? You can know that just by doing this thing, just by looking inside your head. You could know you're thinking about water, right? That's all right? But by the causal theory, if there is such a thought as the thought, water is wet, let's say, then there must be such a thing as water out there, and you must be causally connected to it. So if I do this, and I think, well, I'm thinking that water is wet, and then I reflect, well, if I'm having the thought water is wet, there must be water out in the world, and I must be causally connected to it. So I managed to do that. I know there's such a stuff as water out there just by shutting my eyes and reflecting on what was in my head. That's really weird. How did I do that, right? You would think that in order to, well, I mean, it's not you would think. Obviously, in order to find out that there's such a stuff as water, you can't do it just by this kind of exercise. Yeah? You've got to go and have a look. But if by just looking inside your mind, you can tell that you're thinking about water, and you know that the causal theory is true, right? Because you just thought of it, and it's obviously true, right? Then you know that there's such a stuff as water just by looking inside your mind. You know there's such a stuff as gold just by looking inside your mind. You know that there's such a thing as gamma ray bursts just by looking inside your mind. Wow. I thought they needed all kinds of instrumentation and so on to find out about gamma ray bursts. But no, you just look inside your mind. Isn't that weird? Yeah?
You just said we don't know when we're actually thinking.
Yeah, right. So you could give up on the idea that looking inside your mind, you can tell whether you're thinking about water, right? That's what this seems to suggest. I can't tell just by looking inside my mind that I'm thinking about water or that I'm thinking about gamma ray bursts. Yeah? Yeah. If you could, then you would be able to find out all the stuff about the world outside you just by looking inside your mind. Yep. So there's no easy resting place here, right? These are the choices. So this is really this stuff about informative identities and meaning without reference really blowing up. You'd think that when you look inside your mind, you know what you're thinking, so you know when you're thinking the same or a different thought as before. You think you know, wait a minute, you think you know whether you're thinking, but that would mean that meaning didn't depend on reference. But for a causal theory, meaning does depend on reference. So that authoritative knowledge that you think you have of your own thoughts, I say challenged by, is really just blown up by the causal theory of reference. Yeah, we're talking about the base level of thinking, the base level of meaning that everything else depends on when we're talking about these names that are our direct hookup to reference in the world. And what's going on here is these points about meaning without reference and the informativeness of identities really invading all your knowledge of your own thoughts. last sound bites? Anyone? Okay. Well, on that bombshell, we'll leave Putnam and move on to Evans on Friday. Okay. Thanks, guys.